Okay, I think we're on. Good morning.
Good morning.
Do the official good morning, so it's recorded. Okay, we're in Habakkuk this morning. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk. He's in there. I have some introductory remarks, as I always do before we get started. The first one involves your timeline, so we're just going to jump right in. If you have your timeline, great. If you don't have it, that's okay too. But there's Penny. You're all right. Come on in.
You're not everything.
Glad you're here.
We were just discussing you. Were your ears burning?
Yes. Well, I woke up thinking, I'm gonna go by mom's first, and I almost didn't even hear.
Glad you're here.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you have your timeline, you can break it out. As you can see, Habakkuk there's at the bottom, there with the southern kingdom of Judah. Clint has his little bubble under King Josiah's reign. After studying this book, and I think I haven't even talked to Clint about it, but I think I could probably convince him to move it. Move it a little bit to the right. I actually think that Habakkuk fits his book, his material, all of it. It doesn't even matter really, but I do think just from the context of his book that he fits a little more into Jehoiakim's reign. Because if you'll remember, and this is why, under King Josiah, everything was great, right? There was a reform that took place. He got rid of the idols, the high places, all the things, right? They began to worship God. They found the book of the law. They observed the Passover for the first time, all of those things. So things are really good. And the context and material of Habakkuk's book doesn't really fit that idea, that time. But when Josiah died, his son Jehoiakim reigned, and he was bad. The Bible says that he was, remember Manasseh? He shed a lot of blood, especially a lot of innocent blood, killed children, sacrificed them to Molech, all of those things. But Jehoiakim is the only king who has he's known for killing a prophet. That's in, I have it written down, Jeremiah 26. It was Urijah, I believe, the prophet, and Jeremiah writes about him in Jeremiah 26. Jehoiakim had him killed. And so even though there were evil kings in Judah, Jehoiakim, he reverted everything. He undid everything that Josiah did. And so things went back to worshiping idols and immorality. And then, he even killed a prophet. So I think the material of Habakkuk's book fits better under that, and so I would just slide Habakkuk's bubble over a little bit on the timeline. But all in all things said, it doesn't really matter. He fits somewhere in there. We do know that much. Now, to be so specific as to exactly, it doesn't really matter. But I do think just that's something to consider, considering what he wrote in his book. So. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about that on the timeline. I do want to point out, I don't know, I hope everybody read it at least once. It's just 3 chapters. I think we even had like 2 weeks, right, to go through it. But I don't know if you noticed some of these things, but I jotted down some things. The book of Habakkuk is unique from the other minor prophets in a lot of ways. And so I wrote some things down here. As we've read in the other minor prophets that we've studied, all of them are speaking to the people, right, on behalf of God. Mm-hmm. And that's just generally what a prophet did. But now, Habakkuk, we have him speaking to God on behalf of the people, in a sense, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of different, right? Okay, so there's that. In all the books that we've studied so far, we've seen a God who, yes, punishes his people or other evil nations, right? But we also see the flip side of him, right? The compassionate, merciful God, and we've talked about the remnant that he's always going to restore and things like that. Okay. But in Habakkuk, we don't see that. We see instead a prophet who's asking God why he's not helping. He's wondering where this God of compassion and mercy is, because he's not seeing it, right? So that's a little different. We've also seen in all of the other minor prophet books that we've studied that God does administer justice upon sinful people, whether it's his own people or other nations. And while he's going to do that here, Habakkuk, the prophet, questions God's means of punishment on his people. The other prophets don't ever do that, but Habakkuk does. He questions God about that, how God's doing it. So Habakkuk, all of that said, he stands out as a prophet who's trying to understand God. He's got a lot of questions, right? So he's trying to understand God's purposes and the fate of his own people, like what's going to happen to Israel here, that kind of thing. So those are just some unique differences, I think, that the book of Habakkuk shows us in comparison to the other prophets. I don't know if when you were reading through Habakkuk, if you immediately thought of the book of Job. Habakkuk is very similar to the book of Job. Habakkuk is only 3 chapters. Job is like 40 some, but it's the same idea, right? Job is afflicted. He's a righteous individual, but he's been afflicted and is enduring extreme hardship, right? Trials. And he asks God why a lot. He's questioning God a lot because he doesn't understand. And so in that way, too, is similar to this prophet Habakkuk. And then, of course, you remember how God responds to Job? Do y'all remember that? God says basically, well, let me ask you some questions, right? And doesn't really ever give Job direct answers to his specific questions, but God asks Job some questions, and that silences Job, and he realizes how just who God is and who he is and all of that. But anyway, so we'll see, I think by the end of this class that there's some big similarities between Habakkuk and Job. They're 2 books. They carry they go in the same direction, I guess. And that said, the book of Habakkuk is also similar to a lot of Psalms. I know here at Farmersville, Clinton has preached various Psalms throughout the years, and he has talked about words like orientation, disorientation, new orientation, if you're familiar or remember him ever saying those words. But Habakkuk, the book of Habakkuk, is very similar to some Psalms in the book of Psalms, where there is the psalmist is in a struggle, a turmoil, and is confused or perplexed and doesn't understand why things are happening in this way, and he asks God why. And eventually he comes out to the other side, and and there's this new realization, this new orientation. Psalm 73 is a huge one. I would jot it down. We won't go over there, but that's a big one to show this idea of Habakkuk and of Job from this state of confusion to this new realization kind of thing. So those are just some ways that the book of Habakkuk is unique from the other 11 minor prophets. Habakkuk, the name, as you may or may not know, it means one who embraces or clings. Job 24:8 actually uses this Hebrew word, Habak, Habaq, when talking about clinging to a rock, I think, or something like that. But anyway, that's Habakkuk's name. That's where the root of his name comes from. So it's to cling or to embrace. So I want us to keep that meaning in mind as we go through his book, because I think that by the end of class we'll see just how fitting his name is, considering the things that he wrote in here. So as we dig into this book, I hope we'll be able to see the beauty and purpose of Habakkuk. It's different than the other minor prophets, but I think for a very good reason. Okay, so there's only 3 chapters. We'll take each of those chapters and kind of get the flow of the book. Does anybody have anything to say before we start? Yes.
I just noticed when you're talking about the Psalms and everything, and
Yes.
I noticed this one reading, at the very end of my Bible it says, to the choir master with stringed
Yes.
instruments, which means it was a kind
song.
of song.
It was, yes,
Okay.
indeed. Yep, very good. Yep, chapter 3 is very much a song. It has musical notations in it. You just pointed out one of those. But yep, it is. Okay, so we'll start with chapter 1. Chapter 1, I have it titled a 6-question dialogue. This is a dialogue between God and Habakkuk. Habakkuk starts, God replies, Habakkuk replies to that, and then God answers him again in chapter 2. But in chapter 1 is this 6-question dialogue between Habakkuk and God. You have in verses 2 and 3 the first 2 questions. And then you have, where do I have it here? In verses 12 through 17, you have the remaining 4. So we'll look at each of these questions for the most part. But let's start with the first here at the beginning. So Habakkuk cries out here and says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity or injustice and cause me to see trouble or turmoil? Because plundering and violence are before me, there is strife and contention. The law is powerless, justice never goes forth. The wicked surround the righteous, therefore perverse judgment proceeds." Okay. So this is a pretty dire situation that Habakkuk is crying out about. Really, the heart of this is that Habakkuk, his questions here, his cry stems from some unanswered prayers. He wouldn't be asking these questions if he had the answers, right? Or if his prayers had already been answered. But he has been, I believe, this isn't the first, but he's been asking God. He's been crying out to God. And so he cries out here, "How long am I going to have to keep crying out to you, and you still won't hear me?" So this cry stems from unanswered prayer. He's been crying out to God, and it seems as if God is not listening because God's not answering. You ever been there? If you've lived for any length of time, you have probably been there. We cry out to God for a long time, and it appears as if God is silent to our prayers. But here, Habakkuk's cry is because of injustice. And this is really, he's talking about the sins of his people. They're the ones who are full of iniquity and trouble. There's no justice in Judah anymore. They're corrupt. And Habakkuk's like, how long are you going to let this go on, basically, to God? Everything is in disarray, right? Evil's everywhere, and Habakkuk's crying, "Where are you, God?" We get that, right? Okay, very good. Where is God? But this cry is also from a man who knows who God is. He knows that God is just, that he's righteous, he's compassionate, he's gracious and merciful. He's all of those things. He knows that God is the God of, like Exodus 34:6 says, God that is merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, etc., etc. He knows that that's who God is, but he's not seeing that. He expects to see that, but he's not. So what's prevailing instead is wickedness. Wickedness and perversion, and the righteous are suffering because of it. So there's this huge disequilibrium in Habakkuk, in his very soul, his very being. There's this huge disequilibrium in what Habakkuk knows about God versus what he's witnessing in his life. They're not meshing very well. Everything's upside down, it's chaotic, and he's trying to square it. He doesn't understand. He's in turmoil over it, and it's stressing him out. He's got anxiety over it, because to him, God is not helping this situation, and it's dire. And why isn't God stepping in? Okay, so we get that. Like I said, more than likely, we've all been there at some point or another. This is a very real human emotion and feeling, and we get it as human beings, especially if you've been through it. Okay, so that's the stage is set. This is what Habakkuk is going through, and this is his cry before God. And the Lord replies. This is verses 5 through 11. God replies to him, and basically the gist of what God says here is, I am working. Okay? Now, he doesn't respond to Habakkuk's specific questions. Specifically, I guess. He does respond to his questions, but not specifically, if that makes sense. He just says in general, okay, Habakkuk, I'm working, right? And that's what he says in verse 5. Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I am working a work in your days which you would not believe though it were told you, right? So I'm working. Habakkuk doesn't think he's doing anything, right? But God says, no, I'm working. And then he says, this is what I'm doing. Beginning in verse 6, God is raising up the Chaldeans. Who are these people? Do you remember? Who are they now? Not the Assyrians. Yes, they're the Babylonians, known as the Chaldeans. He says, for indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans. And then he goes on to describe them, right? Are they a nice nation? No. They're pretty bad. All right, so yeah, there's a lot of words in here. I made a list. You can see them in the text. They're ruthless, bitter, and hasty is what the New King James says. They're ruthless, hasty, I think in a hurry. They're all about business here. They're terrible and dreadful in verse 7. They're pretty self-sufficient. They've got everything they need. They're thoroughly equipped for battle. They're violent. They're determined, right? Their faces are set like the east wind, and they're successful. They gather captives like sand. They mock kings, princes. They're very effective in what they're doing. They're boastful, really, is what they are. Verse 11, I really don't like the New King James Version on that one, but the ESV says it very well. They sweep by like the wind and go on guilty men whose own might is their God. So they trust in their own power. That's who they worship, is themselves, basically. They are a god unto themselves for the most part. So they're not a very good people. They're actually a really, really evil nation. Do you think all of that was helpful for Habakkuk to know? Think that squelched and quelled and salved his... Yeah, I think that caused a little bit more stress.
Yes.
And it does, because we see what Habakkuk's response is. Now he's got 4 questions, right? He poses his response, and there's 4 questions in there. Knowing all of this, knowing these facts, make Habakkuk feel any better. It actually really made him probably feel worse. It made things worse because now he's even more perplexed. He was already perplexed about his own people being just wicked and corrupt and unjust, and God's not doing anything about it. And then now he's going to do something about it with an even worse lot of people, right? So that's the dilemma here. God's now going to use an even more wicked people to take care of righteous people, and that's the crux of the questions. There's 4 questions beginning in verse 12, but the heart of it is verse 13, where he says in the middle of this verse, "Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he?" All right, that's the New King James Version. Why do you look on those? That means the Chaldeans. Why do you look on these Chaldeans who deal treacherously and hold your tongue when they, the wicked, devour Judah, who's more righteous than he? So that's the dilemma, the conflict in Habakkuk's mind. That's the crux. That's where the rubber meets the road for Habakkuk. He just does not understand that. And he gives his own bit of evidence here, proof of just how wicked these people are, beginning in verse 14. He kind of, in verse 14, "Why do you make men like the fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them?" In other words, he's kind of indicting God a little bit and saying, why have you, abandoned us? We're like fish with no direction or ruler here, like bugs, have you forgotten us, basically? But then in verse 15, he's talking about these Chaldeans. This is what they do. And so this is what Habakkuk's telling God, as if God didn't know. But Habakkuk's telling God, this is what these Chaldeans do. They take all of them up with a hook. These fish, which meaning, people, nations, other nations. They take them all up with a hook, they catch them in their net, they gather them in their drag net, and they rejoice over that. They're glad over that. And then they sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their drag net. That's what they worship because that's how they prosper. All right. In verse 17, Habakkuk's basically like, so are you just going to let them do this forever? Basically, is what Habakkuk is saying. Are you just going to let this go on and on? Oops, I lost myself. Here we go. And it's the age-old question. A lot of people have posed this question before. If God is all good, if God is all powerful, if he is just, holy, righteous, all of those things, compassionate, merciful, or whatever, how can he just let wickedness prevail? Or how come evil exists if God is so good? Right? It's not a new question to any of us, but that's what Habakkuk's like, come on, this is bad. Why are you, how are you letting this happen? And it's a good question. I know that people struggle with that. A lot of people do struggle with that. Of course, as Christians, we know the answer to that. And Habakkuk's going to learn the answer too, although I think deep down he knows, but I think it takes all of this for that new realization to come to light. But anyway, it's a good question, but here Habakkuk has laid his struggle before God, and then we're introduced to chapter 2, verse 1. I don't know which way to put it first. Habakkuk basically resigns himself to sit and wait for the Lord to respond. He says, I will stand my watch. I will set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me, and then what I will answer when I am corrected. So this may be the hardest verse of the whole book, because waiting is hard, isn't it? Like I said before, if you've lived life long enough, you have probably experienced this. Waiting. Waiting for a test result. Waiting for a loved one to return to the Lord. Waiting for an unbelieving spouse to come to the Lord. Waiting for a new job. Waiting while a loved one recovers after a horrible accident. We all can empathize with this feeling of waiting. It can be difficult. It can be a struggle in and of itself. But I think that we can learn from Habakkuk, and I'm kind of taking just a little detour here to some personal application. We can learn how to do it better, I think, through Habakkuk. Habakkuk, one of the ways we can do it better is this. Habakkuk acknowledged he knew who God was. He knew, despite whatever was going on, that God was holy, that he was just, and he was merciful and compassionate, gracious, all of those things. So he kept that at least in the forefront of his mind. He knew that's who God was. He was reminded that God is working. It may not look like it. It may not seem like it. It may not feel like it. But God is always working. And I think that's a good thing to remember when we're waiting. Another great thing to do while we're waiting is to be prayerful. Habakkuk was prayerful. Even if his prayers were full of questions, doubts, perplexities, confusion, he still took that all before God. And that's a good thing. Be prayerful. Habakkuk also did not just dwell on the negative. Yeah, the situation was bad and it was going to get worse, but he didn't dwell only on that. He acknowledged, like we said, who God is. He knew that God was holy, was of purer eyes than to behold evil, almighty, everlasting, all of those descriptions he uses of God. And so he didn't just dwell on the negative. That can be hard to do when we're living in what seems like a bubble of negative. It seems like there's no good going on. Don't just dwell on the negative. And that involves speaking truth to yourself. I know you've probably heard Clinton say this a lot in various lessons, but it's because it's so true. When we get stuck, especially if it's in the middle of the night and you're laying on your bed and you have nowhere to go and nowhere to be, and you're just thinking, what are you thinking about? All the bad, all the things that haven't even happened yet, right? And probably won't. But that's when it's most important to speak truth. Well, what are the true things to be thinking about? That's what Paul said, to meditate on those things that are good, right, holy. All right? That's in Philippians 4. Habakkuk was also okay with not knowing the answers. He was willing to wait. Right? It's okay, right? To not, if we don't know all the answers, and this is a good example because God, like I said, didn't answer his specific questions specifically, right? He gave a general answer. I'm working here, Habakkuk, I'm working. So he didn't, address his questions specifically. So he didn't get answers to those.
But he said it was gonna get worse.
Yeah, and then what the answer he got was, well, not really what he expected.
Right.
And so then his anxiety just grew from there. It reminds me of, you hear this a lot, and it's all right, there's nothing wrong with it. Whenever a prayer gets answered in a positive way, a lot of people's response is, God is so good. And that's true. That is, yes, he is. What?
You gotta put batteries in there. You got a message saying the battery's out. And it is. Sorry. So somebody's listening.
I was in the middle of a really good point too.
It's over now.
God is good.
Yeah.
All the time.
That's right.
That was your
So
point.
you know what my point was going to be is, well, what if when God doesn't answer in a positive way?
It's still
He's
good.
still
Still
good.
It's still good because
Yeah.
you know it's the best answer.
Well, sure.
It may
God
not be
is,
what you wanted, but it's the best answer.
yes, because God knows.
And you may not see it then, you have to see it down the road.
Yeah.
Or what if you
Hindsight's
never
Oh,
see
you may not
it?
ever see it.
Sometimes we never see it.
And
Even
what
if
if you
you don't
never
see
see
it.
it? That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
That's
God
where
is always
faith-
good.
That's where faith comes in.
Yes, very good. So, back to this. It's okay if we don't know all the answers. God is still on the throne. He's still reigning. He's still good. All of those things. And finally, I have here, when we're in this position of having to wait, be sure and position yourself close to God. That's what Habakkuk was doing here. He was drawing close to God, drawing near to God. Isn't that what James says? Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So
But he answered him.
Oh yeah,
He
yeah,
answered it.
yeah. That's right. But he had positioned himself in such a way prior to this turmoil. Even I think he was a pretty, from what all I understand here of Habakkuk, even though we don't know anything outside of his book, he seems like a righteous individual, a holy man. He was a prophet, trusted to be a prophet of God, and so prior to this turmoil, he had positioned himself already, as to draw himself close to God, and so he continues to position himself there, station himself there. So that's really important when we're going through a waiting period, when we're in the midst of this turmoil and having to wait. Position yourself close to God. Well, beginning in verse 2, the Lord answers. The Lord responds. Thankfully for us, luckily for us, we don't have to wait. I don't know how long Habakkuk had to wait, but the Lord responds here. And he does so in chapter 2 through 5 woes, basically. But in chapter 2, beginning in verses 2 through 4, there are I have here a couple of preliminaries that God mentions here first. First, he says to Habakkuk, I want you to do this. Write the vision so that anyone who is running can read it. That's how plain I want you to make it. That's how big I want you to write it. That's how clear I want you to make it. This is how important this is, so that even if somebody's running, they can still read it. All right? Second, this, he says here in these verses, this is a sure thing. It's going to happen. That's what he says in verse 3. It will not tarry, because it will surely come. Wait for it, he says. All right? So first of all, write it so that anyone who's running can read it. Second, it's a sure thing. It's going to happen. And then finally, number 3, here's the gist of everything else that God's getting ready to say here through these woes. It's verse 4. And this is the climax of the chapter, really. I don't know the climax, but it's the heart of the chapter, the book. Behold the proud. His soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. All right, so that's the gist of that's the point that God is trying to make here. The proud are going to perish, but the righteous are going to live by faith. All right, you all have heard this verse before. It's in the New Testament, quoted three times, I think, by various writers, but yep, a couple of writers. Here's the heart of it. The proud will perish, but the just will live by faith. Okay, so those are the preliminaries. We'll talk more about that verse, chapter 2, verse 4, toward the end of class. But then the Lord proceeds in his response with these 5 woes. The first 5, before we get into the first woe, verse 5 is kind of a capsule summary of all of them together. You see the word proud there? My version says proud. So he's connecting that with verse 4. He enlarges his desire as Sheol or hell or Hades. He is like death and cannot be satisfied. He gathers to himself all the nations and heaps up for himself all the people. So this is what the proud does. This is what the wicked does. Basically, the wicked, this is the general idea here, is the wicked will always self-destruct because they're never satisfied. Think about that. The wicked will always end up destroying themselves because they're never satisfied. And so they just keep going until eventually they destroy themselves. So that's what he goes on to explain here through all of these woes. Number 1, the first one begins in verse 6. I think it's, verses 6 through 8. So this woe is to the extortioners. That's how I titled it here. These are the ones who are really the tyrants of any age or people. It's not anybody specific really, but these are the ones who oppress, right, for their own gain. And God says here they're going to reap what they sow. We won't go through every verse here, but that's the general idea. This first woe is against the extortioners, those who oppress the people for their own gain, and they are going to reap what they sow. It's kind of like the opposite of the golden rule, or the golden rule in reverse, right? They're going to reap what they sow. Okay. Beginning of verse 9 is the second woe. You see it there. It says, "Woe to him who covets evil." who covets evil gain for his house, so that he may set his nest on high. That's the New King James Version. Okay, so this woe is verses 9 through 11. This is a woe to the greedy and to the arrogant. These are the covetous who do whatever it takes to get what they want, to get to the top. It's an accrual of wealth, position, or power in an unjust manner, so much so that even the elements that they gain will cry out against them. The wall, right, verse 11, "For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the timbers will answer it." So the elements, the things that they've accrued are even crying against their unjust ways. They're crying out against them. So these are those who covet, the greedy and the arrogant. The third woe begins in verse 12. This is verses 12 through 14. "Woe to him who builds a town with bloodshed." So these are the ones who take the lives of the innocent for gain, right? But God says here it's going to be for nothing. That's verse 13. I know verse 13 is a little, does anybody have the ESV here to read what? Okay, yeah, will you read it?
What was that? 12?
Verse 13.
"Behold, it is not from the Lord of hosts that people labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing."
Yeah, that's a little confusing, isn't it? Yeah. Well, I know it is, and the New King James Version doesn't really elaborate on it much differently than that. But the idea is that isn't this from the Lord? This is the fact that the people labor to feed the fire, and nations weary themselves in vain. So, in other words, the people are it's all for nothing. They're working, but it's for nothing. It's not. They're not gaining anything here, really. These evil people who build towns with bloodshed, right? I have Jeremiah 51:58, who kind of says something similar about Babylon. "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the broad wall of Babylon shall be leveled to the ground, and her high gate shall be burned with fire. The peoples labor for nothing, and the nations weary themselves only for fire." So all of this that they're doing, all of this evil work, they think they're gaining, but it's for nothing. So the bottom line really is, if you're not serving God and God's purposes, everything you do is in vain, right? It's unsuccessful. That's, if you like you heard it said, if you miss heaven, no matter what you've done on this side of eternity, it was for nothing. It was in vain. And you are deemed unsuccessful. That's kind of what's going on here. They're building their houses and building their towns and building their cities, but it's for nothing because it's against God's will. purposes. All right. He closes that little section with, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." So that's what's going to count. That's what matters, right? The knowledge and glory of the Lord. And the earth's going to be filled with that. That's what's everlasting. Okay. And then the fourth woe is verses 14 through 17. Woe to the drunk and to the violent. I was reminded of the phrase, misery loves company, right? So does sin. Sin loves company too. Sinners always want to make more sinners, don't they? They love having people around them that do the same thing. The more the merrier. All right.
And they don't want anybody reminding them that it's wrong.
Oh, yeah.
They don't want
No,
anybody
yeah.
else around.
Oh, yeah. They always make sure to have the right people.
Right people.
Yep. Those who fully are on board with what they're doing. Babylon, I don't know if you remember, Babylon was well known for its drinking and orgies that followed. I mean, that's just a natural thing. Do you remember Daniel 5? There was a big old party that the king threw there, and it was a big drinking party. So there's an example of one in the book of Daniel. But they will receive their due. That's what's being said here. And instead of being filled with wine, it says you're going to be filled with shame. That's verse 16. Instead of being drunk with wine, you're going to be filled with shame instead of glory. Because that's how that always ends, really. Right? All right. So that's woe to the drunk and to the violent. And then verses 18, 19, and 20. This is woe to the idol makers. That's easy. Woe to the idolaters. This is kind of these verses 18 and 19 really showed the stupidity, I guess, of this venture here of the created, you and me, the created creating something in order to worship it. It can't. What does it say here? It can't speak. It doesn't teach. There's no breath in it, but yet we trust in it, right? There's no profit in there. It can't speak, move, or breathe. Therefore, it can't guide or instruct or care for anyone, right? It reminds me of, I just read recently about Elijah. I was reading through that account again about Elijah and the 400 or the 850 prophets, false prophets, right? And remember, he was on Mount Carmel and he called all of those prophets together during the reign of Ahab, and he set up, had them pick a bull, and they set it up on the altar, and then they were to call on their gods to call down fire, right, on the bull. And do you remember that Elijah, I can just imagine him laying back there, just kind of pretending like he's taking a nap. He calls out and says to them, maybe you need to cry a little louder. Maybe your gods are sleeping. Maybe they're away on a trip. Maybe they're, and he's just doing that. He's mocking them, because they're foolish, and so he's just calling them on their foolery. And, but it's pretty hilarious. There's a little sense of humor there from Elijah the prophet. Anyway, that's how dumb it is, really. And so this is woe to these who create idols in order to worship them. But the whole point is verse 20. But the Lord, that's the point. But the Lord, He actually resides in His holy temple. So let all the earth keep silent before Him. He resides in His holy temple, God says, which means that He's ready. That's what He was there for, right? Remember when God put His presence there? It was for the benefit of Israel, so that they knew He was in their midst, that He was going to be there to help them for whatever, whenever, that He was available. That was the point. And so that's the point here in verse 20. The Lord, He is at the ready, always available to help His people. And so now the stage is set for chapter 3. In chapters 1 and 2, Habakkuk is wondering where God is, right? That's the basic idea. Chapters 1 and 2 chapter 1 basically. Habakkuk's wondering where God is, and God answers and says, I'm where I have always been. That was pretty profound for Habakkuk, I'm sure. God answers and says basically, Habakkuk, I am where I always have been. And not only that, but I am working like I've always been working. So then what you can imagine what's left. What's a godly person left with after that? What's he going to do now? Well, he's going to bow in prayer and praise to God because of that. And so that's what Habakkuk does. He received his answers, right? God is still there on the throne. He's still working. And so Habakkuk prays a prayer and then sings a hymn maybe, or ends it with praise, with a song to God. So let's first look at the prayer. This is verses 2 through 16. This is the chunk of the book of the chapter, the prophet's prayer. Basically, in verse 2, he acknowledges that he. What do I have here? Yeah. He gets it now, basically. Habakkuk gets it, and he stands in awe. My version says, "O Lord, I have heard your speech and was afraid." I like the ESV better. I think it even says, "I stand in awe," or something like that, of God. So that's how he begins this prayer. And then verse 3. Oh, I do want to point out verse 2 and verse 16. Do you see where it says, I have heard, and then I heard, when I heard? Those are like bookends to his prayer. Verse 2, O Lord, I have heard your speech. And then in verse 16, when I heard it, this is what happened. Okay? So we see the bookends here to this prayer. I have heard, and when I heard. And then beginning in verses 3 through 15, there is what scholars call a theophany. Have you heard that word before? Theophany? Okay, yeah. It's the appearance of God in great power and glory, I guess, really. Kind of like Exodus 19, where God fully showed his power on the mountain. Remember that? When God came on the mountain, and how extreme, at least to us it is, extreme that was, with the fire and the smoke and the thunder and the lightning and all the earth, the whole mountain quaked, right? And the people were so afraid, they were like, okay, nope, we can't do it. We can't handle it, right? So it's like that. So this is what this chapter really pictures for us, this another theophany, I guess, but it harkens back to God mainly and his presence and his power in bringing the people out of Egypt, appearing on the mountain. Even there's a reference to Joshua here that we'll notice, but there's a theophany being described here. And I don't know, we won't have to, I hate going through all the verses, it takes so much time. But the language, when you read through there, if it didn't remind you of when God delivered Israel out of Egypt, it should have. With the description of the waters and even the chariots and horses and things, and it should remind you of when God came on the mountain, on top of the mountain, and the land trembled, and and things like that. Okay, so it should remind us of those things. It's just showing God's power. He's greater than the Chaldeans' power, in other words, right? He's more powerful. He's the most powerful. Okay, where is it? A verse? 11. So this is harkens back to Joshua. The sun and moon stood still in their habitation. That happened in Joshua's day. You remember that? Joshua chapter 10. But this is verse 16 is Habakkuk's realization. This is when it clicks in Habakkuk's mind, I guess. He says, when I heard, my body trembled, my lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered my bones, and I trembled in myself that I might rest in the day of trouble. When he comes up to the people, he will invade them with his troops. The ESV says that I might wait for the day. I think that's a better translation, just because we get the idea here. Of course, what does it remind you of when you read that? My body trembled, my lips quivered, rottenness entered my bones. I trembled in myself. I don't think necessarily. I do think a little bit of like a severe trepidation, like scared to death kind of feeling. But I also think of a healthy fear here, a standing in awe. This is what, in the presence of God, this is what Habakkuk's doing. He's realizing God's presence and working through history, right? Beginning with bringing God's people out of Egypt, and then visiting them on the mountain, and then even helping through Joshua's day, and so on. God has been working and showing his power and glory through all of those situations, and Habakkuk stands there and realizes, okay, well, God's still doing the same thing now. He's still going to do the same thing now. And he resolves himself to just now wait for that. I'm going to wait for that day. He calls it the day of trouble because it's going to be, that's what it's going to be. Babylon's going to come in and take all the people away, right? All of God's people away, but he's trusting in the workings of God here. It's still, the situation hasn't changed. The circumstance hasn't changed for the better, has it? Judah's still evil. Babylon's still going to come. Babylon, the more wicked and evil nation than Judah, is still going to come and reap destruction on God's people. But now Habakkuk's in a place where he can he's okay with that.
It's like when when we pray for something and it doesn't happen the way we want, we have to go through a period of time that we have to learn to accept what God chose for us.
Sure.
And to look on the right side that he's God and he knows.
Very
So
good.
then you get this peace.
Yeah, very good, very good. And so that's why he can sing in verses 17, 18, and 19 what he says. He sings, though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. In other words, even though all of these things may be bad, right? These are bad things. This is livelihood here that we're talking about, and they're all failing. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will make me walk on my high heels. So rather than just toughing it out or hanging in there during a struggle, being passive, Habakkuk rejoices. That can be hard. He allowed the struggle, the conflict, the disorientation to work in such a way that he could come to a new realization, a new orientation about who God is, how God works, how, whatever, because of chapter 2, verse 4. The just live by their faith. That's how come. And Habakkuk is prime, supreme example of somebody who did that very thing here. His faith was struggling, right? It was struggling pretty severely. He didn't understand a lot of things, but he let it work, or at least he maintained his faith. And so he shows us what living by faith looks like when we're struggling. It can be a good thing if we'll let it, right? If we'll, not give up. You probably have known of Christians who face difficulty or a certain difficulty, and then they just give up on the Lord altogether. Quit coming to worship services. They just, and go back into the world because, I don't know, but that's where they think the answers are maybe, or it's easier, I don't know, but or it's because, well, we know going through this kind of thing is uncomfortable. It's not easy, it's not pleasant, it's hard, it's difficult, but it's worth it. Mm-hmm.
I can read through this. This was one of my favorite ones because it's so, in my mind, it's so applicable to the world today.
Mm-hmm.
That the world is full of
Yes.
everything that he is talking about
Yeah.
now.
Yes.
And you do find yourself thinking, what is God thinking? What's going on? How bad is this going to get, And you're fearful. And he remembers and reminds us, Habakkuk does, how great God is, and that there is an answer, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, to not give up faith, and to realize that this is God's plan. And whatever happens, it's gonna be God's plan. And for us to remain faithful and to keep praying. This was one of my favorites.
Yeah.
And I understood the whole thing.
Yes. Yeah. Me too.
Yeah.
Faith when you can't see what's in front of you.
It's an unexpected book of the Minor Prophets, I think. It's one that could be highly recommended to anybody who's struggling. If I would say, go read Habakkuk. There are a lot of Psalms you could read, and things like that are along this line, but you can also go read Habakkuk, Job, but that's a really long book to read. But Habakkuk, you get the gist of it in 3 chapters. But I think it's encouraging and comforting. It's helpful. Okay, I want us to go, before I conclude everything, I want us to go to Hebrews chapter 10. This is one of the instances where where a New Testament writer quotes from Habakkuk 2:4. Hebrews chapter 10. We get a New Testament example of what this looks like, the just living by faith. So beginning in verse 32, Hebrews 10, verse 32, the writer here says, "But I want you to remember the former days, in which, after you were enlightened, you suffered or endured a great struggle with sufferings." So he's talking to these Hebrew Christians who, after they were converted, they endured some kind of great struggle with suffering. So they were facing a difficulty here, right? Or they did. And he says in verse 33, "Partly while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated." So they were treated reproachfully, and they were also associated with those who were treated badly. And verse 34, "For you had compassion on me in my chains, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and a more enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. Therefore," he says in verse 35, "don't cast away your confidence in all of this, which has great reward, because you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. Then he quotes here, for yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith. But if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. So, do you see here this idea from Habakkuk? It's coming. It's going to happen. The good, the ultimate good here, the promise of eternal life is going to happen. It's a sure thing. You remember God saying that in Habakkuk? This is going to happen. It's a sure thing. But the just have to live by their faith. Verse 38. Don't draw back. Don't go back. Don't fall away. And verse 39. But we are not of those who draw back, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul. So we see here the Hebrews writer taking that monumental statement of Habakkuk 2:4 and applying it to New Testament Christians in this chapter of what a just person's faith looks like. It's an enduring faith. It endures the struggle like Habakkuk did. Right? Do we see it? I think it's a beautiful way this Hebrew writer drew that passage out of Habakkuk and used it here to apply to these New Testament Christians. The just living by faith is an enduring faith. It's not empty. It's not for nothing. It's enduring. Okay, it's what a real faith looks like. And of course, chapter 11, verse 1, there's a whole chapter on faith. You see the connection here that the Hebrews writer goes into now. Here he says, now faith, this is what it is. And takes a whole chapter explaining what it is. In order to encourage these New Testament Christians who are struggling. That was the whole point of the book of Hebrews. They're wanting to go back to Judaism. They're wanting to go back with what they had known, because this Christianity was difficult. They were facing persecution, hardships. It was getting hard to be a Christian. And things were just so much easier when they were just Jewish. You know what I mean? Worshiping under Judaism. So they were tempted to go back to that system, and the Hebrews writers encouraging them, no, this is what true faith looks like. It endures. Don't go back. Okay, so I wanted to bring that out because I think that's significant to Habakkuk. Romans 1:17, I think it's verse 17. I don't know if I have, is it? Okay, is the other place where Paul quotes Habakkuk 2:4. And then somewhere in Galatians.
3:11.
Say it again?
3:11.
3:11, thank you. Galatians 3:11, Paul quotes it there again. We won't go to those, but anyway, that's the other places where it's quoted. Okay, so in conclusion, what does Habakkuk's name mean? What's its root? Remember what Habakkuk's root
One who embraces.
Embrace.
Embrace. All right, so now, thinking about everything we just said, do you think that the prophet learned how to cling to the truth of the just living by faith? Do you think he learned how to embrace that and to really hold on to what that means? I think so too. So when wickedness seems to prevail, when we're struggling through days of darkness and uncertainty, and it seems like God is far away, be like Habakkuk. Trust in the God who is sovereign, who is just, who is merciful. Remember that he is working, even if we don't see our outward circumstances changing, or if they don't change for the better, or if they get worse, right? Trust in the God who is sovereign and rejoice instead of just toughing it out or hanging in there, right? I know that's a good thing to do too, but instead be actively rejoicing in the God who is still working, right? Yep. And allow the transformation to take place. Hopefully you will be able to move from this disorientation to a new orientation, moving from this uncertainty to a new and better understanding, a deeper faith. That's what it's all about, at least in Habakkuk. All right. Does anybody have anything else? I hope we all see that. I'm with Mary. I think that's probably one of my favorite minor prophet.
Yeah.
Because it's so personal, I think. We feel with him through the book. With the other minor prophets, it seems like just a bunch of, just history and facts and, while we can feel a little bit with, the oppression and, the horrors of immorality, but it's here with Habakkuk, it's more like, wow, I've been there. I've felt that in a real way. I've been through that. So Habakkuk, like I said, is unique. It's unique and different from the other minor prophets for that very reason. Okay. We have 3 minor prophet books left. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. We will, actually, Zechariah is like, how many chapters is it? 14 or what is it? I don't remember. It's long.
Yes.
14.
14? Okay. So what we're going to do
not
is
minor.
we are going to take Haggai and Zechariah together in one class. I am not going through those books like I've kind of gone through these other books. But instead, because those 2 books have to do with when the remnant comes out of Babylon, Babylonian captivity, back to Jerusalem. Okay? And so what I'm going to cover in class is that part of history, I guess, so to speak. But yes, still read Haggai and Zechariah because they're important. But now we're shifting gears in history now. Up to this point, we have talked about, all the prophets have talked about is how, these 2 kingdoms, the north and the south, are getting ready to meet their due, right? They're getting ready to, right? And so we've read through the prophets and where the north goes away into Assyrian captivity. And now we are done with all the prophets who talk about the south going into Babylonian captivity. So now we're shifting into a new piece of history, a new period of history for God's people. They have been in Babylon and in captivity there, and now they're coming out. Okay, and so Haggai and Zechariah are prophets who had to do with when they came out and were returned to Jerusalem. So we're going to talk about those 2 books together. But like I said, not so specifically in those books. It would take too much time. I don't have that much time. VBS is coming. I got a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
So we're going to just take a broad historical look at those books and where they fit and what was going on there. And then we will take one last class to do Malachi. And then we'll be done. And then I will have to take a break.
Yes.
I will have to take a break. I have a wedding.
Yes.
Okay. Did we assign a prayer person? I don't remember. That was
I
several
think
months
it was
ago.
me.
Oh, good. Yay. Would you? Thank you.
Dear God, Father, thank you for today. Thank you for having all of us here. Thank you for allowing us to understand and read and learn from your word. Please help us to always remember that you are almighty, powerful, just, merciful, that you give us the grace we need to remain faithful to you, even though times may not show your presence, that let us remember and rejoice that in the knowledge that you are there, Lord, you are working there. Thank you again, Lord, for today. In your precious Son's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mary.
I hate when
That's
there's
very
so
good.
much up
Thank
here
you.
and it won't come out here.
All right, we've all
Bit,
been there.